Okay, let's go ahead and get at it. We're going to jump into the minimum wage, and then we're going to talk about wage discrimination. So we've got two chapters coming up here on wages, and you're going to see a little bit of overlap, just to kind of warn you, as I warned you before. And again, when you follow along the outlines, now these are not long sections, so if it seems like we're moving through this stuff pretty quickly, that's fine, because there's just really not the outlines are really just not that long. So what we're going to do is we're going to start talking a little bit about the minimum wage, and I've only got one graph to show you, but you know, the minimum wage is something that's fairly new to economics in the world. So you think about how many thousands and thousands of years people have been selling their labor. There really hasn't been a legal price floor, and that's really what the minimum wage is. So as we begin our discussion here, we want to define the minimum wage, and the minimum wage is really just a legal price floor. That is to say, wages can't drop below a particular level because it's written in law. All right. Now, in the United States, we have a very clunky, and that's my word, all right, a very clunky minimum wage system, in the sense that there's a federal minimum wage that applies across the country, but the minimum wage law that we're going to talk about here in a second allows states on their own to increase the minimum wage if they wish above that floor. Okay, now states in turn allow local governments to raise the minimum wage above their state levels. Okay, so it's kind of a clunky system, but again, a lot of this is part of and unique to American federalism. All right, we have different levels of government covering the same geographic territory. So the point behind all of this, of course, is that we have different minimum wages across the United States, depending upon whether states have decided to take the authority given to them under the federal minimum wage law and go ahead and increase the minimum wages, and of course whether the states themselves have decided to allow local governments to do it on their own. So about every 4 years during a presidential election, the minimum wage becomes an issue, right? It pops up, and we have a lot of discussion over it. And you see a lot of positions taken by advocates, those that think minimum wage is a good idea, and those who oppose it. And we're going to talk about the arguments here. So basically, there are 6 arguments that those who support minimum wages, a minimum wage law, make. Number one is it increase, and by far the most important, so certainly get down this in your notes, is it increases income for the poor. Okay, if you want to call it the working poor, that's fine, but really for the lowest socioeconomic levels, there is some guaranteed price floor written in law, so it increases the wages of the absolute poor. Number two, and an argument that is maybe new to this, all right, is the idea that it actually stimulates the economy. All right. Now, if you think about why that is, right, if you guarantee a particular wage to a population, it's not like they're just stowing it away and putting it in offshore bank accounts or something like that. They're buying staples, right? They're going to buy bread, milk, shave cream, whatever, and they're going to do it at the local store, and that money gets turned around, right? Now, remember, weeks ago we were looking at the time velocity of money, and the faster the money moves through the economy, generally, the much more healthy that economy is, right? Number three, the third argument, is that it helps people plan for retirement. It allows them to actually save for retirement. Now, this is an argument that's made, but frankly, it doesn't hold a whole lot of water, and it's not that I'm going to spend time talking about each argument and which ones hold water and which ones don't, but generally the propensity to save, all right, that is to say the ability to save and the actual action for people at these levels is pretty minimal. So yeah, maybe they can retire somewhat or plan somewhat for retirement, but they're not going to have much money to do so. Generally, the group of the population we're talking about here that would take advantage or would have an advantage with a minimum wage are those that are really going to be heavily dependent upon Social Security, and it's really going to be a level of Social Security that's subsidized by other higher payers. All All right, next, this is kind of the warm and fuzzy argument, and that's not a knock on it, it's just my own description of it, that this is part of social justice. That is to say, it's the right thing to do. All right, that if we're asking people to serve us food in a restaurant, or cut our hair, or do clean up parking lots or something like that, that they should have some minimum guarantee of income. That's it. We got to take care of these people that we're asking them, when we're asking them to do these types of jobs that most of us wouldn't want to do. All right. Think about cleaning parking lots, things like that. That's just work we most of us wouldn't want to do. And that's not a knock on people that do it. It's just not necessarily desirable work. All right. The fifth argument, and probably one of the best arguments you can make for the minimum wage, is that, frankly, it's better than unemployment. All right. Unemployment certainly is funded through a tax. All right. All those of us that have jobs, we pay part of the unemployment tax, and our employers pay some of it as well. But the idea is that if somebody is unemployed, that has to get paid out. It's basically a form of insurance. Nobody wants to have to pay out on insurance, right? The companies don't. People don't want to have to pay taxes to support an insurance fund for the unemployed. But the idea is if they're making a minimum wage, that's at least enough to attract them, get workers off the sidelines. Remember a couple weeks ago, we were talking about the supply of labor. When wages go up, people get off the sidelines, they get excited about work, and they go work. All right? So it's better than unemployment. And the last argument, and it's probably the argument that comes up more so every 4 years in presidential elections, more so than any other one, is the idea is that, well, prices really don't increase that much. Maybe they go up when we have a minimum wage, but they don't go up much enough to the point where we would really notice it. And on balance, again, measuring it with social justice and the fact that this is better than unemployment, it's really the right thing to do. Okay, opponents. All right, now opponents certainly have their arguments, and we're going to start right with that idea of a price increase. Those who oppose a minimum wage, generally the first argument they're going to make is that prices go up, right? It's a tax. It's an artificial tax, just like a lot of things that we've talked about that are artificial taxes. And we're about ready to get into international trade, not certainly today, but here in the future. And we're going to talk about how tariffs are essentially a tax, right? But there are lots of ways. We talked about all sorts of things in regard to what is a tax. Monopolies, when they price goods and services, right? It's a form of a tax, and there's a dead weight loss associated with it. Same thing here. Another argument that opponents will make is that it actually encourages teenagers to drop out of school. Now, in the United States, of course, we have compulsory attendance laws, compulsory education attendance laws in most states up till 16. So once you decide, once you reach the age of 16, you can decide at that point whether you're going to stay in school or not. States differ as to whether you need parental support for that decision, but nonetheless, you can certainly choose to do it. The opponents will make the argument, well, if there's at least a guaranteed minimum wage, then teenagers will say, okay, I don't want to pursue an education even at the high school level, and I want to go elsewhere, and I'm going to go work someplace where I know I can make that minimum wage. All right, next. And one of the more powerful arguments that opponents will make is that it actually causes unemployment. That if employers have to pay each worker a little bit more, there's going to be less of a salary pool, if you will, and some workers will get laid off. All right. Now, opponents tend to make this argument fairly effectively. All right, and they point to some sectors of the economy where that's going to happen. We'll evaluate that here in a little bit. Okay. And the last argument, and it's probably not a good one, but it's one that pops up every now and again, is that opponents will make the argument, well, not every wage earner is leading a household, right? The idea is we kind of assume that you have to have a minimum wage to take care of your family. Well, opponents will say, well, not everybody who's out working is leading a household, all right? Maybe there's a breadwinner in the household that makes a significant amount of money to the point where you don't have to pay another person a minimum wage. Again, just arguments back and forth. So what I want to do now is go ahead and take a look at what the minimum wages are, okay? So we're going to go over the national level and also the Ohio level, and then we'll look at some other highs and lows across the country. So in the U.S., right, It's $7.25. So that's the federal minimum wage. So that is to say, nowhere in the country, right? Nowhere in the territories, the American territories, Puerto Rico, District of Columbia, what have you, can they reduce, all right, can employers pay workers less than $7.25 per hour for, again, full-time work. Now, in Ohio, we have decided to go above that floor, not by much, all right, but $8.15, okay? $8.15. So if you think about essentially where this minimum wage, let's look at the federal minimum wage. All right, this is about $14,500 a year, right? So, you know, let's just, for the sake of argument, look at one of the opponent's chief arguments that this will attract teenagers to the work world and they won't finish their high school education, right? Well, the idea is that if you wanted to drop out of school at age 16, you could do so and then right away start making $14,500, right? And again, we've talked about how you kind of equate an hourly wage. So, you know, this would be $16,300, right, if in Ohio. So the idea is you'd get a little bit more in that, 90-cent pay differential between the federal rate and the Ohio rate would make a difference, okay? Now, what I want to do is switch gears and look at the Fair Labor Standards Act and minimum wage laws in general. Now, this statute, right, this is a federal statute, it's 1938, it's passed during the Great Depression, right, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and what it did is it created for the first time in our country, again, minimum wage laws, the whole idea of these things, very, very new. For the first time created a national minimum wage law. Now, it is true that many states, certainly not a majority, but many states already had these in place, even for a couple of decades, right? And the Roosevelt administration, this is President Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the Great Depression, said, look, we've got to do something to stimulate the economy. So we're going to make sure employers have to pay about this much. Instead of this much, this much. And then those workers will take that extra money and go buy stuff. Buy stuff from firms that make that stuff. Those firms that make that stuff will hire other employees. Those employees will now have a salary. They'll go buy stuff made from all these other firms that make this stuff, and all those other firms will hire people to do so, right? So a lot of times you think, you know, you want prices to be low. Now, generally, remember from many, almost a couple of months ago, we do want a little bit of inflation. This is a good thing. But again, think about what the government was doing. It's trying to stimulate the economy, stimulate demand. We're very much a consumption-based demand side of the ledger type of economy. Now, with that said, the question becomes, did it work? And the evidence is that it worked at least a little bit, right? It would have been interesting, probably a better scenario in the end if the world didn't fall into war in World War II. World War II, of course, put demand on steroids, right? And think of all the things that we had to make very, very quickly for the war effort, and all those people, millions and millions of men and women, right? That went to work to promote, to help support the war effort. Now, with that said, let's say we didn't go to war. Let's say the world didn't devolve into World War. It would have been interesting to see how effective the minimum wage law would have been. Maybe it would have taken a decade, maybe even longer to get us out of the Great Depression. But again, these are things we don't know. Okay, now, a couple things just to finish up the Fair Labor Standards Act. It creates a national minimum wage law. It also states that the minimum wage applies to those working full-time, 40 hours per week. All right. Now, one of the important things to keep in mind with the Fair Labor Standards Act is that it did define for the first time a national standard work week of 40 hours. Now, most states had something similar to that, all right, before 1938 when the statute was passed. And in Ohio, as an example, it was 48. All right, so I can remember my dad telling me vividly that my grandfather, all right, was expected to show up to work on Saturdays, right? You worked Monday through Saturday, right, instead of Monday through Friday, and you worked 8 hours a day. So the expectations, you show up on Saturday for work, and it was 8 hours. And so most states had something like a standard work week, and there were other benefits attached to it. Okay, now, The other thing the Fair Labor Standards Act does, or the last thing that we're going to kick around, is it requires time and a half for overtime. Okay, so on that 41st hour for qualifying workers, right, an employer must pay that person 1.5 times, right, their salary, right? So if you think about it, let's say it's just a straight up and down minimum wage worker, right, you're going to have to pay $362.50, right? On top of this amount here, right? So, a little bit more than $3.50 on top of that $725. Now, again, think about what the federal government was trying to do in 1938. Wasn't really trying to penalize employers or even reward workers, right? Or penalize employers saying, hey, you're working your staff too much, that type of thing. It did serve as a tax, right, with the goal of doing the following: making it painful enough for an employer who said, well, I've got this many hours of work I need done, right, instead of paying one person to work more than 40 hours, which you can, you just got to pay 1.5 the rate for overtime. Or maybe you hire another worker that you don't have to pay overtime to. Again, getting more workers into the workforce, those workers buying stuff made by firms that make that stuff. The firms that make that stuff hire people to make that stuff. Those workers go out and buy stuff from other firms that make that stuff. You get the idea, right? A way to stimulate the economy. Okay, now, with that said, all right, when it comes to the minimum wage law, is, as we had mentioned before, that we have kind of a clunky system, all right? States can go above the floor, and states can let their local governments go above the floor. So the highest state is actually Massachusetts, all right, just state, and they go, whoops, they go $11 per hour. Okay, the District of Columbia, by the way, which of course is not a state, so Washington, D.C., right? It's actually $11.50, okay? And there are two cities that are actually quite higher than that, all right? You never know when this stuff will come up, right? All right, both Seattle and Los Angeles have 15. And again, by the way, even in Los Angeles, there's pressure to go above this. Now, if you think about it, in Seattle, the state of Washington has said, cities, go ahead. If you want to do that on your own, great. In Los Angeles, of course, California saying, hey, cities, if you want to go above the floor, that's fine. Go ahead, knock yourself out. All right, but if you think about it, minimum wage in Seattle, right, is $30,000 a year. And in Los Angeles, it's $30,000 a year. Now, locally, right, one of the fears was in both of these cities. Now, by the way, these were local. The result of local politics is that, well, if you're a firm in Seattle, maybe you're going to move outside the city limits, so you don't have to pay your workers as much. All right. If you're a firm within the Los Angeles city limits, you're going to move outside. All right, the city limits, so you can pay your workers less. It never really happened, right? It never really happened. So one of the arguments opponents would make is that, well, you're going to force workers to go elsewhere, okay? For the sake of argument, employers in Massachusetts, they're going to move to Connecticut or Rhode Island or something like that to pay their workers lower. It never really happened, right? It just never really happened. Okay, now with that said, all right, you get some of the ideas here. One last thing that I want to mention. Let's just get rid of some of this stuff here. It's kind of urban legend, I guess. It's probably, I've been doing this so long that a lot of people think, well, minimum wage laws only apply to hourly workers, and it's not the case. All right. If you're a salaried employee, right, and you're making $14,500. I mean, you think about it, your employer can't say, well, instead of paying you hourly, I'll just pay you salary so I can escape it. It doesn't work like that, all right? Salaried employees are entitled to protection under minimum wage laws. Now, where it generally pops up is that all of a sudden this employee has working their 41st hour, right? And the employer says, "Oh my gosh, I gotta pay you more." And the employee will probably bring it to their attention if they're not afraid of their employer, right? Depends on those employee dynamics and how they're getting along, I guess. Okay. Now the question becomes, right? When does all this stuff kind of kick in, right? When do these guarantees kick in, all right? Well, the number we're going to use is $24,000, okay? It's actually 23 and some change, but on the exam and for our purposes, we're going to stick with 24. So the point I want to make here is this, all right? If you're making $24,000 a year or less, you're entitled to protection under the Fair Labor Standards Act, okay? All right, now, so as an example, let's say you're making $11.50 an hour, all right? That's below $24,000 a year, all right? It's $23,000 a year if you're making $11.50 an hour, all right? You are still entitled to time and a half for overtime. It's not really until salaried workers start making, oh, let's just make the math easy, $25,000 a year, that the worker can be told by their employer, yeah, you're going to have to work 42 hours, 43 hours, something like that. All right, now, there's some gray area there, but I don't think we really need to get into that. Okay, so let's talk more about the raw economics of this stuff. I mean, a lot of what I just kind of went through was law, admittedly, but let's go ahead and talk about the tie to the labor market. All right, let me get some of this stuff out of the way here. Okay, so let's talk about the tie to the labor market. Now, as we had started at the opening here, all right, what a minimum wage law really is nothing more than a price floor for labor, right? It's a wage floor. Price, wages are just the price of labor. Now, what it does, of course, is in some sectors, now by the way, not most. Some sectors, it's an artificial floor, all right? It's an artificial floor, okay? So what you're looking for are situations where we know that the equilibrium rate, right, of pay would actually be lower than minimum wage. Now, folks, there just really aren't that many areas, right? The problem, of course, is that we have a lot of difficulty identifying them because we have the minimum wage. So how would we know? How would we know what type of employment people would be willing to engage in for $5.50 an hour, $6.50 an hour, right? Now, admittedly, there are some illegal forms of employment that might take place. You think about somebody that's maybe working 40 hours a week cutting grass, which I cut a lot of grass when I was in high school and college, that's making $7 an hour. Clearly illegal, but nonetheless, some of that stuff just isn't going to be reported for our purposes. Okay, so what we want to do is just kind of diagram, right, with a graph here, all right, what this surplus kind of looks like. So we're going to start with our standard graph. We've only got one graph to look at in this section, okay? And up here we're using wage, right, which is just nothing more than the price of labor. And out here, the quantity of labor. All right. All right, we'll make that demand. All right. We'll make this supply. Okay, and we'll throw in our equilibrium point here. Okay, so this is quantity at equilibrium, right? And this is wage at equilibrium. Okay, so you get the idea. And we'll go ahead and label this point. We'll call it point A. All right, just as we've been doing. Okay, now if that's equilibrium, let's talk about how you would graph in. You can probably see where we're headed because we've done this before. We just did it with goods, right? Surplus goods, shortages of goods, that kind of thing. So this is really going to be no different. We're just looking at labor. So let's go with a little bit of light brown here. All right. all right? And we're going to call this wage 2, but it's also, I'm going to put it in parentheses, the minimum wage, right? Now, think about what we've done here. Let me just make this a little bit more pronounced, right? Think about what we're doing here. All right. Otherwise, we actually have a labor surplus, right? Now, if you think about, we'll just go ahead and drop this down, right? Use red here. This would be the demand. Yeah, we were using blue there. Okay. This would be the supply. So we'd actually have a labor surplus, all right? So the idea is that when we, just like what we've been talking about beforehand, when we increased wages, right, we got all these people off the sidelines and they said, what? Well, hey, I want to go work, right? All right, so nonetheless, the question becomes, do you create a labor surplus with the minimum wage? In theory, you do, okay? But again, we don't know really where this point is because of the federal minimum wage law. All right. Now, there have been some interesting studies where you look at a state like Ohio versus a state like Michigan, and they have two different state, right, because states can go by the floor, two different state minimum wages. And you look at Ohio and Michigan because their demographics are very similar, cost of living is very similar, a lot of those same variables that frankly you can really control. And this is true of many parts of the Midwest, by the way. You can kind of control this. It's some fascinating research. And you say, okay, well, let's say in Ohio it's 8:15, which we know, and let's say in Michigan it's 9, right? How many people are willing to work in Michigan for 8.50, right? Okay, you get the idea. But getting below the federal floor is almost impossible because, number one, we've got the federal minimum wage law, so there shouldn't be any activity here, right? Let's just say this is, just go ahead and put it on the board, and let's say this is, $7.50 per hour, right? Okay. There just isn't much activity, and the little bit of, we'll call it black market activity that's taking place, these people aren't going to report it, and the reason they're not going to report it is because, fear of the federal government cracking down, right, all sorts of things. It is true, this is one of the issues that we have with immigration, but one of the the counter argument is that, well, number one, if you're only making, let's say the illegal immigrants are making $6.50, but you don't have to pay all the other taxes associated with this, maybe that's even a little bit higher. On the flip side of that, what we're finding is that illegal immigrants that come into this country and make, do whatever they're doing and making a living, even if it's being paid under the table, so to speak, they're actually making more than $7.50. So trying to find that, it's pretty much a long-winded way of trying to say we really don't know where that actual equilibrium point would be because we've got this floor. Now, in theory, again, it creates a labor surplus, but it just hasn't. I mean, there are so few sectors where 725 would be the standard. There are some areas, a lot of times we assume fast food, things like that, but, most of this, of course, is dominated by supply and demand. The idea is if firms want workers, they're going to have to pay more to get them, right? And we've seen these periods, especially right now, where the unemployment rate is 3.7%, and even fast food restaurants are paying a considerable amount to get people to come and work for them. Okay, now, with that said, we're going to start this point here, and we're going to talk about it continuously throughout. The question becomes, right, staying right here, it's $7.25 an hour, wherever that minimum wage rule would be. What type of workers is this actually helping, right? If it helps anybody, it's helping low skill and no skill workers. If it's helping anybody, right? Low skill and no skill workers, right? And that's even in some sectors, and frankly, not many. Now, a whole bunch of reasons for that, but nonetheless, again, the $7.25 really isn't enough to attract workers. Okay, now let's talk about the price the price floor. So, and we're going to leave this graph up here, okay? Now, essentially what we have here at W2, this is the minimum wage now, right? Above wage 1 at equilibrium, we're going to call it $7.25 an hour just to make life a little bit easier. So we'll stick with the federal rule, okay? This becomes the floor, right? Anything above this, right? Let me use a different color. Use orange here, all right? Is above the floor. Now you can say, well, no kidding, Jared. I get it. All right, but the idea, right, is that this could be an artificial gain for an employee, a worker, right? And anything above this would be an additional gain. All right. Now, again, this is specific to certain sectors of employment. Again, low skill, no skill. It's really going to help those types of workers. Okay. Now, the question becomes, for our purposes, is to whether, in fact, let's go ahead and identify those, and we're just going to make it easy. So, in fact, let me go ahead and carry that wage 1 over a little bit just to give ourselves some room. Okay. We're going to call this gap 1, all right, and I think we're using light brown. Let's go ahead and take this sucker a little bit, all right, and we'll just maybe have one end of this. Whatever this would go up to, all right, we'll call it gap 2, all right. The question becomes whether gap 1 and gap 2 added together really creates a tax, right, for consumers that they have to pay when they're buying goods and services produced by those minimum wage workers, right? Or is it really a source of inflation? Inflation is a form of a tax. Remember, we talked about that a long time ago. Same thing with employers, right? Employers say, my gosh, I've got to pay an extra tax to hire workers that I think I could get less. All right, the answer is in the overwhelming majority of circumstances. Then that means, for our purposes in economics, the overwhelming majority of employment, forms of employment, right? Employment markets, right? It doesn't at all, okay? The reason why is that really, in fact, let's just go ahead and put a marker, a star, something like that, all right? The equilibrium point's probably up there, all right? So what I want you to get down in your notes is this: in the overwhelming majority, all right, of labor markets, forms, sectors of employment, whatever you want to call it, all right, the equilibrium rate's probably well above minimum wage, well above any price floor that we could otherwise create, and it's way up there, and it's just not creating a real source of inflation. Okay, now, I want to make one comment about the teenage labor market. To be real blunt about it, this is probably the only place where we can truly